We will jump in, and as others join, they will just catch up. But so good afternoon if you're here on the East Coast, and good morning or good evening wherever you may find yourself today. Thanks for joining Orr Group Talks. We have some fantastic guests here with us today, and we're going to have a what I just know will be a dynamic and interesting conversation. So we appreciate you investing your time with us. I'll go around the horn and tell you a little bit about who's here, set a little bit of context, and then we will jump right into the conversation. Hopefully you all can participate in the conversation. I will give you some directions on how you can do that as we go. But first, let's meet our panelists. That sounds like a very game show host thing to say, but let's meet everybody. Let's start with Mary Boak. So Mary is the Senior Vice President of Development at Teach for America. I've had the opportunity to get to know Mary over the last probably 6 months to a year. We've started a little bit of a roundtable group of some other national chief development officers, and I've always admired TFA, and just it's been great to get to know Mary, and I'm glad that she's here with us today. So thank you. Also with us is Mark Wire. Mark is with ACLU, another organization that needs no introduction. But similarly, I've gotten to know Mark the same way that I got to know Mary, and I just think the scope and breadth of what they do just gives him a view into lots of different pieces of fundraising that the rest of us don't see. So I'm excited to have Mark here and share his thoughts. Also with us is Lisa Ratliff. Lisa is the newly minted permanent CEO of Kaboom. She's been acting CEO there for much of the last year, and prior was their vice president of partnerships, and has just been a great friend, and I'm so excited to have her with us. And so excited for Kaboom and for Lisa for the opportunity to benefit from her leadership. I think if there's a common thread amongst the leaders that are with us, their organizations are extremely different. So the common thread is there is no common thread. But they all have very different missions. They all have very different approaches to fundraising, and there are three very different leaders with different backgrounds. But I think they're uniquely positioned in that they're all working across wide spectrums of geography and type of donor and type of community. But I also think each of them in their own way is not complacent, right? So in the last year, we've all been forced to deal with change, but these are all organizations that have constantly changed, that have constantly sort of been on the leading edge of figuring out what comes next. And I'm just excited for us to talk a little bit about that now that the rest of the world is being forced to change on a regular basis. Couple of housekeeping things. If you have questions, you'll see at the bottom of your screen, there's a little box that says Q&A. If you submit your questions there, we'll get to them, I promise. There's also the chat feature. If you have sort of any tech issues, you could put it there. If you want to say hello to each other, you can also use the chat function there. For those of you that it is not possible for you to sit still in front of a keyboard, you can sort of put your energy into saying hello to people over there. And I think that's all the housekeeping. So I guess a couple of things I wanted to start with from a premise perspective coming into this conversation. Leading nonprofits is complex, probably more complex than it's ever been before. I like to tell a story of when I started working in nonprofits. Our CEO used to, and this is probably only a slight exaggeration, he used to come in at 10 o'clock in the morning. He would gather everybody together that worked for him and give them their directions. Then he would go around the corner to an Italian restaurant and read the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times while drinking a bottle of wine. And then around 2:30, he'd come back to the office so to make sure everybody did what he said. And by like 3:30, he was on his way home. And he had it dialed in and everything was working great. Like 10 years later, I was the CEO and it seemed a heck of a lot more complicated. But I think that has happened in reality, right? I think we are more complex organizations. We've got lots of different stakeholders, board members, staff, constituents, donors, and they don't all want the same thing. They don't all need the same thing. So that's added a level of complexity. And the pressure to grow, I think, is bigger than ever. It's not, for most of us, it's not growth for the sake of growth. It's an urgency of the work that we're doing is important, and we just need to do more of it. So there's that pressure, which then comes with a whole bunch of financial and fundraising pressures behind it. So we'll get into some of that and just how this talented group of people are leading their teams through it. Lisa, I'm going to start with you. At the beginning of the pandemic, I was telling everybody like the keys to success were to be aggressive and be out there and raise money. and hopefully you had some cash in the bank at the start. A year later, I think my biggest observation is the organizations that have been able to really thrive have a strong culture. We were talking earlier before we all sort of jumped on with you, just how strong and I think unique the culture is at Kaboom. It's one of the places I've seen where the mission really comes through. This sort of playfulness and joy really drives what you do. So I'd be interested for you to share with the group a little bit about Kaboom's culture, and then how have you managed to sort of maintain that and or foster it or change it or evolve it over this past year?
Yeah, and Craig, thanks for having me and us. You are a great friend, and we've got a good history together. I will say I've worked a handful of places throughout my career, and no culture has been stronger than the culture of Kaboom. So you're right for naming that. We take our cause seriously. We are the cause of play and bringing communities together. And you come into our office and it's everywhere around you. You know what we're doing. But it's also in the things that you don't see. So we hire for culture. It is, we could have an amazing candidate, and if they're not there for our cause, if they don't have a little bit of playfulness and appreciation for the joy of childhood, if they can't commit to leaning into equity, specifically racial equity, then we know that they're going to struggle. And so we hire from the very front end. I was hired as a culture fit. So it starts there for us. And then it's just reinforced along the way. We do a lot of fun things. There's play infused into us. Our culture has had to adapt, not just over this past year, but over the past couple of years. And last February, we have norms and values and essential traits that we expect from staff that have always been there. And historically, they've been team fit, can do, will do. When more is expected, good is not enough. And our staff said, we've changed. And so our staff has really influenced the evolution of our culture, where now the things that we value and name as important, both in hiring and in just our everyday practices and what our programs and our work looks like, are partnership, humility, equity, play, accountability. And those came from the staff. We have an always listening, always learning approach. I'm always listening, always learning. And I think that has what's helped us over the past year. Though some of the things you're naming are certainly important. If you are not financially solid, your culture is going to struggle because you've got to make tough decisions. And we've certainly experienced that. But I think the throughput and kind of what's held us together is that we do have core things that we value that are centered in community. I think some new things that we've picked up that we haven't named are grit, kind of problem solving, that, everything is not going to be perfectly placed around us. And we've got to lean into a little bit of chaos. And that's been a lot different this past year. If we're going to survive to thrive, that's been a necessary shift we've had to make.
Thank you. And I think that sort of evolution of listening to the team and letting them drive the culture is an interesting one, right? Because I think we've all, I don't speak for everybody. I know I've grown up a lot, right? Like, and what I think was important 20 years ago isn't what I think is important today. And I think, a lot of where you first start working drives the culture. And it's like, all right, it was, the first person in the office and the last one to leave. And, you look back and you realize how much of that really made a difference. And, when you can value the things that really matter, you'll get the same results and everybody will be better for it. So I think it's an interesting, I don't know, I'm interested in that. Mark, let's talk a little bit about sort of ACLU. I mean, I think by one count I saw, you've got a team of 80 fundraisers raising $200 million a year. I mean, you're everywhere and nowhere all at the same time. But what are you sort of seeing out there? Maybe give us a little context of how the ACLU fundraises and sort of what trends are you experiencing?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you, Craig. And I wish we had a little more playfulness and joy in our culture. I'd have to say we're a pretty serious organization, but we are going to try to do that. But in terms of what we're seeing, we we've obviously been in a pattern of growth for a while now. We are a federated organization, so we have 53 affiliates across the country and a national centralized office in New York. Every single affiliate is their own separate 501c3 and 501c4, as is the national office. And so because we're federated, the affiliates do not report in. We are bound by shared policies and a shared commitment to our mission and to a shared culture, I would say, that we really try to invest in. And so much of the model, I would say, in terms of fundraising for the ACLU revolves around how we share revenue internally. It's often a struggle with federated organizations to have equitable sharing. We have a really well-developed, robust sharing model that has been evolving since the 90s, I would say, that basically says all revenue is shared. It doesn't matter who raises it. It doesn't matter where the donor resides. So that creates a lot of incentive for healthy fundraising practices. And also we are able to take advantage of economies of scale. So since we have a large national office that's centralized, we can centralize the work that makes sense to centralize. So we put the big kind of high volume direct marketing fundraising in the national office. We have a cost sharing formula that we then use to share the burden of those investments kind of across the network. We also centralize like our planned giving marketing, for example, and we have a separate planned giving cost factor to share out those costs. And so the result of it becomes really kind of comparative advantage. So if the central office is able to have those economies of scale and really be efficient with our fundraising, then the affiliates are the ones who have the proximity. They are on the ground. They can really spend the time and prioritizing the major donor relationships. And that's what we really try to encourage, because that's just the most efficient way for an affiliate to raise those funds. So we struggle then to figure out how to be clear around roles. We want to make sure small examples of things are like every major donor who is in a portfolio has one relationship manager assigned to them. That might be in the affiliate, might be at the national office, but we've gone through the process of just having that kind of clarity, so we know kind of who's directing the strategy. Some of the challenges I would say that come from that. I mean, those are the strengths. I would say some of the challenges are that because we are fundraising often from progressive donors, the areas of the country where civil liberties are most at threat are not always the place where all of our donors are living. So our sharing rules don't necessarily reinforce equity, I would say. So then we're forced to work around the rules in a way that seems fair. And that means creating, campaigns that might be above and beyond. We're doing a Southern Collective campaign right now focused on racial justice programming in 9 Southern states. So we're going to be asking donors who don't live in those states to support it. And so we are going to have to kind of make arrangements with those home affiliates to make exceptions to the rule, because this is such an important initiative for the organization. So that's definitely a challenge. But yeah.
Well, I mean, the whole concept, I mean, most affiliate models where there is this tension is over revenue. And I'm sure you have tension over revenue like anybody else, but the fact that you're immediately already in a sharing model sort of lowers the temperature on a lot of that. And I do think you're well positioned in that. I don't know, the world is shrinking, right? Like donors are becoming less parochial. Like the idea that a donor in New York will now care more about what you're doing in Georgia is far more real than it probably was 20 years ago, right? Where it was more probably, no, I care about my backyard. So I think it's an interesting sort of model that you're in, and it's much further along, right? I mean, we work with a lot of affiliated organizations. I think you all know most of my career I've been with the Boy Scouts. I see a couple of old Boy Scout friends on the line today, but that is not the model there, right? Like, and I think the model creates almost a competitiveness that is, detrimental. but Mark, just one more thing on that. So how do you balance like the needs of local affiliates versus the national organization? Like, I mean, you have a lot of bosses, right? So how do you kind of maneuver that and balance that?
Yeah, it takes a lot of work to kind of invest in alignment. We actually created a team within the National Development Department called Nationwide Development Resources, and that team is focused entirely on kind of building our nationwide fundraising model, working with affiliates, doing those portfolio reviews, providing onboarding for staff, training, resource sharing, business intelligence reporting that is kind of advanced and constantly improving in a way that the affiliates really appreciate, because it's not the kind of resource they can create necessarily on their own. Best practices, DEI integration into all of our work. So having that team internally focusing on alignment, we do weekly calls nationwide with our entire affiliate development and national development colleagues. And I have to say, Zoom has been a game changer with this. You know, before we may have seen people in person once or twice a year, and now we see them literally weekly on Zoom. And so we're building a community that suddenly doesn't feel like we're so far away from each other. And I think what you're saying, Craig, about donors not feeling that way either is true. We're seeing that those geographic barriers kind of breaking down.
Yeah, it's while by about 5:30 today I'll be cursing Zoom. It really has been a total blessing. You know, we were using a lot even before the pandemic, but I don't know how any of this would have worked the last year. Mary, I'm going to come over to you. And as I said at the beginning, you know, I find each of your organizations, but in particular Teach for America, has a tendency to not accept the way it is and recognize where it needs to change and evolve, right? So I know you're on this sort of journey to transform sort of how you do centralized versus regional fundraising. You know, if Mark and ACLU is sort of over here, you know, you're on a road to get there. A lot of people would have just accepted like, this is the model that we have and I have to work within it. Guilty, you know, as charged when I was doing a similar role. But so talk to me a little bit about that. Like how is that, like, you know, you're trying to leverage the power of the central brand and the central systems and really have a more cohesive approach to fundraising. How is that working, and what are you learning as you go?
Yes, thanks, Craig. Yeah, it's been a busy and changing time in development at Teach for America, and we are going through this transformation that began on March 2nd of last year. And so, as you can imagine, if I had known what was coming down the pike, I might have paused on that. But I actually think in some ways having sort of disruption writ large actually allows us to just completely rethink what we want to do anyway. And you'll probably hear themes from what Mark was just saying. And I do have to give him a bit of a shout out because he's been, you know, a good friend to me as I've been on this journey, because Teach for America is only 30 years old and ACLU has in many ways figured out a lot of the things that we've been seeking to do. So you'll hear echoes of what I talk about from Mark. But, you know, Teach for America, unlike the ACLU, is one 501c3. And at various times in our development history, we have either been an extremely centralized development shop to now where we are right now, which is far more localized in manner. And that has come about because from a programmatic standpoint, we realize that K through 12 education is a very local operation. And so what children in K through 12 education in South Dakota needs are, you know, those needs are very different than what's happening in Houston, Texas, or in New York City, right? So from a programmatic standpoint, that decentralization has made a lot of sense. But for, you know, as anyone who has ever lived in a completely centralized or a completely decentralized model knows, there are, you know, benefits and drawbacks of each. And so the decentralized model we found ourselves in has been extremely successful during our growth era. So from 2000 to 2015, we essentially went from an $11 million budgeted organization to a $350 million budget. Our development results were on a 21% compound annual growth rate. So that extreme growth, we needed to have sort of decentralized autonomous development teams on the ground, building new relationships, building new markets, and building the deep local ties that were necessary, not only from a funding perspective, but from a programmatic investment perspective, and to build who we were, what our brand was, and our connections with communities. Now that we've become a bit more mature and we've moved and our growth has sort of tapered off and we're in a bit more of an impact approach in our mission, we've realized that this decentralized model is sort of hitting breaking points. We're seeing, especially in fundraising, a loss of economies of scale, a lot of duplication of efforts across the system, and a lot of variability in terms of fundraising outcomes. Very strong performance in some of our local work and ones where we're missing the mark year after year. And because of the advantage we have as being one 501c3, I might be accused a little bit of trying to have my cake and eat it too. And then I'm trying now to get the both of best worlds. How do I get the benefits of deep local ties, which are so critical for development, which is a relationship game, while also from a business perspective, trying to zoom out and think about some of the things that Mark was talking about, which is who really is best positioned to do these things. Not every development team across the country needs to have a gift processing shop, for example. And so that's really what we're trying to move towards. And so if I were to sum it up, the three things that we're trying to do are: one, yes, maintain this local presence and tie, ensure that local donors who do care about their local communities have the presence, have a primary relationship holder who feels close to home and close to the local ties, while also bringing sort of our geographic footprint up a bit. So as just a concrete example, we right now have 5 independent development teams in the state of Texas. We're going to move to 1 development team in the state of Texas. So you still have those local EDs with those relationships, but a broader team infrastructure behind them. We're trying to get much more precise and sophisticated about donor assignment. I've probably studied Mark's donor assignment and revenue sharing policy more than he has in the last year. And we're borrowing from all these other organizations so that we really can, again, get precise about when is the central team best positioned to manage a relationship or manage a type of philanthropic venture, and when is it actually best in the local team. And by the way, recognizing that just because a relationship might be managed centrally, like a corporate relationship, does not mean there's not a deep local relationship also happening too. And then I think also to Mark's point, figuring out the incentive system, both for the purposes of broadening a donor's aperture and really seeing the breadth of what Teach for America is able to accomplish, and also so that we can accomplish equity. And Mark really spoke well to this, that right now, primarily how a fundraiser is incentivized is to fundraise for the location that they are in, which creates incredible inequities across the system in terms of where funding happens to be, not where funding happens to be needed. And so by changing the incentive structure, not only can we ensure equity across how those funds are used, but also take a more donor-centric, user-centric approach to say, who is this person? What do they care about? And how can I bring them into the breadth of all that we have to offer in our work, bringing access to K through 12 education to children?
That's fantastic. And I think to me, the thing that jumps out in both of those models, where you're going and the trip you're on and sort of where Mark already is like, there's a necessity of trust and there's kind of a maturity too, right? Like there's a maturity required to sort of say, you're right, me, local person, is not the best to manage this relationship, or vice versa, right? So I think that's great. And I'm really hung up on your idea of we were losing economies of scale, right? Like I think everybody thinks of how you can get economies of scale, but there's a point at which they reverse, and recognizing that is huge, because most people.
Yeah, the thing I also talk about is just not taking too blunt an instrument, because I think we often talk so much about, all local, to be tailored, personalized, exactly what is in the community, or all central, right? Because there's efficiency, there's economies. And really, again, this might be the, having the cake and eating it too, but I think there's a world of both.
Yeah, I mean, everybody likes cake, so I think that's the best strategy, right? So. Lisa, I'm going to come to you with a very admitted strong bias, right? So you've just taken on the role as the permanent CEO at Kaboom. I think more organizations should look to their fundraisers and fundraisers generally as CEOs. This is a little bit of soapbox, right? But I think 1, CEO jobs involve a lot of fundraising. 2, they involve a lot of board management. And usually fundraisers have worked a lot with boards. And then, I was a fundraiser, so obviously I think, I could do it better, right? So I think I have that bias, I admit, but as you've taken in, you've been the interim and you've been in the role, how has having been the organization's chief fundraiser served you well now as its chief executive?
Oh yeah, I'm with you. I have a bias as well. I think my experience as a fundraiser and even some of the comms work I've done in past life has made me given me a unique advantage. I think other than, you know, the work that you do with boards and the work that you do with fundraisers sit in this really interesting place that is like at the intersection of everything. So you're working with partners, you're working with finance, you're working with programs, you're working with community, and you have this beautiful space that you're in where you get a 360 view of things. And you try to learn to navigate, okay, the resources that are coming from whatever funder with the aspirations of the programs and the needs of the community, which, you know, if you're in a different kind of role, you don't always get to see that 360 view. You don't always get to either raise resources for the right things or raise resources that backfire on you. And there's a lot of lessons in that. And so my experience as a fundraiser has been incredibly valuable for this position. And I think one of the unique gifts I've had, for the past 20 years is the ability to also go out in the field. So the fundraising positions that I've been in, I have worked a lot in community. And now I'm at an organization that centers community and is doing everything that we can to take all the energy and resources that funders bring and direct them to respond to what the community is identifying as their greatest need. And I think it's just been really special for me to have a background where I have a lot of memories and pictures and experiences and partnerships that have been formed from ex-community member and their family or this group of community members. And I think a lot of us need to work hard with the energy of funders to direct funds toward community needs. So having that experience and point of view, now that I'm a CEO, is really helpful because I don't want to be in a position that is narrow-minded. Now I'm, you know, all teams are my teams. It's not just a fundraising team. And having that space, that special space in that intersection before where you had to like have relationships and understand and appreciate all parts of the organization, though all teams weren't my teams, I had accountability to all teams. And so that I think gives a fundraiser who has experience in fundraising who now moves into a position that's making decisions for the organization, a unique advantage.
Excellent. So for any board members that are on the line, that is a commercial to look to your fundraisers and fundraisers generally. you're looking for a CEO, but I think, you know, maybe most importantly, are you having fun?
I was telling you before, I love my job. I've always been a person who's walked into the fire, and it certainly has speed bumps along the way. And we're coming out, we're coming out of a pandemic, and so I don't think I would have said, you know, I want to be a CEO when we're not volunteering, we're not using public space, when funds are freezing. Never would have said that, but I also see, you know, my glass is always full kind of person. There's air in that glass as well, so it's overflowing. So we have had the opportunity to stretch and grow, to think about doing our work differently that is going to carry forward in the future. We had been trying for the past couple of years to really look at, you know, a high percentage of our funding coming from the corporate community and a high percentage of our work being driven by volunteers who want to engage in working with the community to build a playground, and a high desire for us to be able to go into community and better understand what's going on in community. How can we be responsive? Do you need a playground or do you need an adventure course for youth? And that is like competing, right? So you've got funders who are saying, we would love to volunteer, we would love to do XYZ, and communities that are saying, well, this is what we need. And this past year has really taught us that we can learn to focus first on impact. So we typically construct about 150 playgrounds a year. And last year, we didn't have volunteers. We didn't have people going out to community to design, but we used technology and we still got the input from community. And we were able to shift our partners to say, hey, the product is so important. And I don't want to say more important than the process, but more important than making sure we get all the volunteers out to get it done. And that has taught us a lot about how we can really lean into making an impact without compromising our model and engaging our partners in a new way. So though I would not have said, when I become a CEO, I want these conditions to exist, it has been an absolutely instrumental year in our learning in everything that's going to take us forward to success.
Yeah, I think all of our organizations and each of us personally are sort of, for all the horror and the heartache of the last year, you're learning and doing things that you would never have done otherwise. And I think we're all coming out the other side of this. Those of us that are coming out the other side of this are coming out better for it. So that's a little heavy, but we're going to get, there's a couple questions building up in the Q&A box. Please put your questions there. I promise I'm going to get to them. But Mary, while we're on this sort of topic of CEOs, I think yours isn't a unique situation, but I think of it as a little unique. It's not one I've dealt with where, we all need our CEOs to be involved in fundraising. So sort of basic question, would love to understand your CEO's role in fundraising. But I think there's a nuance there of like, you're young enough where there are still donors that know the founder and probably still know the founder and are used to having that relationship. So how does your CEO fit into fundraising and how does that whole dynamic work for you?
Yes. I mean, I really am fortunate in my role to be in a situation that I think every fundraiser hopes for, in that I have worked with two exceptional fundraiser CEOs, both who have understood the critical role they need to play in fundraising and who also happen to be quite good at it. So it's sort of a double whammy there. I mean, so I'll just say this. I mean, our CEO now and previously is critical to our fundraising operations. We could not get the type of support that we do without her deep involvement. And I'm happy to go into the tactics, but in every way that you could imagine, her time, her energy, and her commitment is spent in that. In terms of the founder transition, I mean, that is something that I think a lot of organizations go through. The biggest challenge was the initial transition, right? When Wendy was handing off the reins of CEO to Elisa Villanueva Beard, who is our new CEO. And she had been the CEO for so long that people get accustomed, it takes time for people to get accustomed to someone. I think to Wendy's credit, in her work, there really has never been and was not any ego about her role specifically at Teach for America. People were, of course, invested in her because she was an excellent leader, but she was always clear that this was about the power of the idea, right? That investing in the leadership of strong, diverse, exceptional K through 12 leaders, that was the ticket, and it was not about her. And I think, many, if not all of our funders understood that. And I think the other thing we have always talked a lot about at Teach for America, especially because our work is leadership development, is that when we build relationships, any relationship, but especially donor relationships, we don't talk about just building personal relationships between a donor and the CEO or the executive director. We actually talk about building organizational relationships, that the relationship is with Teach for America. And of course, our partners need to believe in this CEO, they need to believe in the executive director, but they also need to see excellence in their leadership team. They need to see excellence in all of the leaders in the organization and have relationships with those people. And so we are always thinking about how are we building, pretty deliberately a multitude of relationships between donors and staff so that they are seeing different components of the organization. And then, from a practical perspective, when there is a transition, because there will be a transition, the CEO or the local executive director is not the only person that donor knows and believes in. And so that's very much what happened when Wendy transitioned. You know, the national board, the regional boards, and many of our donors already knew Elisa because she had been the COO for some time. And, you know, that didn't mean we didn't have to spend extra time building a very different form of relationship. And so we scaffolded that. You know, Wendy stayed, you know, remained involved for a time. She was chair of the board for a while. Then she was a member of the board until eventually, you know, she wasn't a part of the donor relationships at all anymore. And as I said from the start, you know, with that scaffolding and discipline, I don't want to say that this just happened. We were able to build, you know, trust and relationships with Elisa because she is incredible in her own and different way. And she has made that commitment, as I said earlier, to development and investing her time in that.
Excellent. I think that's very helpful. And you're right, a lot of people deal with that founder issue. I always think of it, it's a little bit unique in Europe, quite just in that, I don't know, in our world, Wendy is almost, you know, like a celebrity, right? Like I've sort of went to the airport and like even say hello, even though like we were coming from the same board meeting. Like, so I don't know, I just was curious how you'd explain that. Mark, when I look at your career, I'm just a little bit curious, like, you know, you've been at dynamite organizations, right? WNET, the public television station here in New York, International Rescue Committee, now ACLU, like, how'd you get into fundraising, right? None of us, I don't think, grew up wanting to be fundraisers. So how'd you get into this?
Yeah, it's a good question. You know, and when I see people like Lisa, you know, kind of going through the ranks and becoming CEO, seeing that journey is really inspiring. And I have to say, I had no sense of that journey when I first started in development. I kind of fell into it after getting a master's in nonprofit management, kind of knowing that I was pulled towards mission-based work and just thinking of the amount of time we spend at work, that I really wanted it to mean something, not just to me, but to the world or communities at least. And so I was kind of always headed in that direction, but I didn't really know what it looked like until I found myself in development. And like Lisa had mentioned, this idea of having, you know, a real 360 view when you're in that function. And that was something I started to understand once I began the work and really kind of fell in love with. There's just such a also kind of an intellectual stimulation, I would say, from development, because you are working closely with the program, you are working with donors who are really interesting and also very engaged in the work. And so it's a continuous learning opportunity. It's like you're getting a new master's every year because the programs change and evolve. And especially when you are able to shift organizations, like having been at the International Rescue Committee and WNET and the New York Public Library and now ACLU, each one is so, you know, kind of big in their field that it forces you to get up to speed really quickly. Like when I first started, Anthony, the head of the ACLU, you know, said it's going to be like drinking from a fire hose, but it doesn't stop. You know, like it's really hard to keep up. But that's also the exciting part. I think what keeps us going.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I never could have predicted that this is what I would do for a living, but I could not imagine having done anything else, right? Like it is every day is interesting, and I don't know. I'm with you. I'm curious. What sort of advice would you give fundraisers, right? Somebody sort of coming up now as a fundraiser, Mark. What would you tell them to do or be thinking about?
I mean, I would say find a mentor or maybe a few mentors. It's something that I didn't really take advantage of myself until a little later in my career, and it had such a huge impact once I did. Just, you know, the field of development is all the more complex. You know, like Craig, you were saying, it's not what it used to be when I first started, and navigating that complexity is something that is not easy to do, especially when you're new in the field. So I think just finding people who've been around for a while and have seen kind of the development of different areas and have a real understanding of the career advancement opportunities within the field, they will love the opportunity to share what they've learned, often you know, through not so easy learnings as they went along. So find a mentor, just invest that time. It'll really pay off.
Yeah, definitely. Now you look and you just, yeah, been blessed to have a lot of great people that I've worked with and not even realize they were mentors. And now that you can just call them when you're mature enough to recognize what they are. And now you can actually know what to ask them is just, is powerful. I wish I figured that out a little bit sooner. I'm going to hit a couple of questions from the Q&A real quick. And then I want to get into another topic. Lisa, there was a question for you, pretty direct on sort of the norms, values, essential traits that you started with. Where are those sort of documented? They're in your strategic plan. They're, hanging on the wall. I think I know the answer, but you go ahead.
Oh, I'm glad that came up because I should have said it everywhere. They are on the walls. They are in our performance appraisals. So when we're planning, doing our job plans, when we're getting appraised, we're getting appraised based on how we're living out and acting and making decisions around our values. They are coming up in our, our culture captains, our all staffs. But if you've been to our offices, you look around, they are written on the wall, and they are impossible not to know. And then we're held accountable every year when we go through our performance appraisals. We're appraised on how well we are living out our values.
Yeah, I was just this morning talking with our chief operating officer about that point and performance appraisals. And all right, I want to get into something that's take us a little bit of a turn here. But I mean, since the murder of George Floyd last year, organizations have really come forward, put a lot of attention, a lot of discussion, tried to put sort of equity and issues of societal barriers for people of color at the center of their mission. That's good, right? That's period, end of sentence. That is a good thing. And I think in almost all cases, I will say it's being done authentically, and we'll give the benefit of the doubt to the others. But it's helped me realize that there was a set of organizations that were doing this before last year. And Lisa, that's actually how we had met. There was you and James, the CEO at the time. I mean, Kaboom has always been about equity, but maybe didn't sort of shout that from the rooftops, right? It was sort of a byproduct of what you were doing. And the two of you really sort of came to like, no, it needs to be at the center of what we're doing, because we'll do everything differently once we do that. Kaboom's got a head start on this, I guess, is where I'm getting to. What have you learned on this journey as you've sort of, what have you had to change to really put equity at the middle of everything that you're doing?
Yeah, that's another everything answer. And so though we, nonprofits exist to help address the gaps that are in communities. So, and that's most of the time in Black, brown, minority, female, whatever the situation is, it's something that the resources have not been properly distributed, and now the nonprofit needs to exist. And for us, our big wake up call was we built our 3,000th playground in the same community that we built our first. And it was a huge celebration. We were also in a moment where a lot of our staff were like, we need to embrace diversity, we need to embrace inclusion, and we need to name racial equity in our work. And so we made a decision to say, we've got work to do. We've got to look on the inside and figure out, how can we be doing better? And so the first thing we did was we got help. And we'd formed a diversity, equity, and inclusion task force with staff who were amazing and passionate. They were doing this on their spare time. And we knew that, the way we do our programs needs to be reviewed, the way that we look at compensation and everything. Like, we need to really address this if we are going to take it seriously. And so we hired 2 consultants, and one of them did an assessment of our language, our policies, our everything, and then reported back to us on, here's where you're missing the mark, here's what you need to pay attention to. And then another one put all of our staff through a series of training that grounded us in a different reality than we had been taught. And it was all about historical and institutional disinvestment. And it got us all like synchronized on the same kind of foundational truth, which I think was necessary. And so both of those 2 things together then informed the culture shift that we had to make, because now we have a new understanding. And then the changes that needed to show up in our programs, in our vendor selection, in our performance appraisals, in everything. And we have also had a lot of conversations with others, and lots of bruises, lots of scrapes. We have not gotten everything right. We've had to apologize. We've had to have tough conversations with funders who weren't living the values that we were proclaiming as an organization, and our staff was holding us accountable for that. But I would say, like, if anybody's like leaning into this and trying to figure it out, that we shouldn't be doing it as alone, not as development staff, not as a sector, that we should be talking to each other. We published our journey paper, and there's a lot, but we probably should do a part 2 of it because there's so much more since the time it was written and published early last year. But we published our journey paper to share with others, like, this is our journey so far, and here's the things that we are committing to as our next step. I know other organizations have done that as well. So the more that we can learn and share with each other, the more that it fast forwards our work. But we do know that we have to hold ourselves accountable, not just in making statements, but in looking at how our programs are either serving or providing a disservice or perpetuating an issue that was already there, and how the equity that exists within our decisions internally is something we need to lift up and hold ourselves accountable for. And the consultant we use reminds me often that it is urgent, lifelong work. And so though I am ambitious and want to get stuff done, that it's, act like it's urgent, but it's not. It's hundreds of years in the making. And so it's lifelong work.
I think there's a certain type of person that does fundraising for a living, and I find we're all by and large list checkers. So that's an important thing to remember. Like, this is not one you're ever going to check off the list, right? Like, this is an ongoing thing. And what really had jumped out at me at the time, and you were the first organization I started doing this when we were getting involved with you, was like the recognition of, like, we're going to need to raise our money a little bit differently too. Like, we're raising money in a way that almost like, this is simplifying it, but in some ways, like, the funders are picking where we build playgrounds. We want to do it from the other way, which means we've got to come to people and say, no, this is what we're doing. And it was the first time I'd seen someone too say, like, hey, this is working for us, but if we don't flip it, we can't really do what we want to do. So that was very, 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 very powerful. And Mary, I'm going to come to you because the very first conversation we ever had, you asked me what I was seeing and hearing in terms of organizations being anti-racist in their fundraising. I did not have a particularly good answer. I still don't have a particularly good answer. I think people are trying, and we're working, and we're doing it with the organizations we work in. But I don't even know yet if we've been able to sort of define what it is, right? Like, we know it's not what we've got now. So I'm just curious, what are you sort of learning as you've continued on that journey after I was of no help to you? What have you learned and moved forward with?
Man, I kind of just want to like have everyone rewind the recording of Lisa and just repeat a lot of what she said, because I think it's similar. I think the first thing I want to emphasize about what I'm learning on this journey is it is a journey. I don't think any single person has it figured out. Certainly not me, certainly not Teach for America. I think the most important thing we've done is that we've committed ourselves to this work and named it, as a top strategy priority for the team, right alongside our revenue priorities, right? Which I think is the first start. So that it's just constantly living in our consciousness and in our time allocation, that we're actually setting aside time to do this practice, to do this reflection. And I think Lisa, touched on this. Racism in this country is a multi-generational pandemic. And so it's going to take a lifetime of a commitment. And so how do we continue to step against the moving walkway of it all, but ensure we're also constantly focused in the now, but say to ourselves, there's not going to be an arrival moment. Like, we're not going to suddenly have that checked off, as you said. I think maybe the second thing, which I think Lisa also said that I've learned, is the importance of getting outside counsel on this. And Teach for America has done that both as an organization, and we've actually done it specifically as a development team, because we have recognized racial inequity as deeply enmeshed in what has been a root cause of educational inequity in this country for quite a long time at Teach for America. But we are not all, and I certainly am not an expert in the theory and practice of racial equity. And so rather than come up with our own solutions independently, we have sought a lot of outside counsel and guidance to help us, including the Racial Equity Institute, Crossroads. I mean, there's some wonderful, incredible organizations out there. I think the third thing I really have come to believe is that a lot of this does have to start with self-work and self-practice. You can have all the policies, procedures in the world, but if you are executing them in a manner that is steeped in dominant culture ways of being, white dominant culture ways of being, there's just a ton of blind spots you're going to bring if we don't first break down those racial barriers for our teams, our teammates, and our work through deep exploration of our own sort of ways of being and practices. And then I think finally, as it relates to fundraising, which is probably what I think you really want to know in terms of concrete tactical things. I mean, we haven't done it all, but we have put our entire national board and all of our regional boards through a racial equity training to start with some of our biggest champions and our biggest donors. And it is not backing away from anything. And our entire staff, including my team, will go through that same training as well. We're sort of in phases of teams going through that to be done throughout the year. In development, we have started thinking about our annual letters and how we recognize donors, how we talk about the history of racism and its ties to educational inequity in our narrative and story of the problem, and thinking about that in our grants and what we write about and talk about. Who do we accept money from, and what is the racial equity experience we have to engage with them on once they have become in partnership with us, just as we are doing with our boards. And then my own team started an equity audit last February to actually have an external organization look at our processes, practices, so that we could have an external lens on things that, I certainly wouldn't be able to see as well, given my position and my identity. So those are a handful of things.
I mean, loud and clear through there is, talk to other people and seek outside help, which, not to stick up for all the consultants in the world, but seeking outside help is usually a good idea. Mark, at ACLU, I mean, how are you all facing into this, bringing DEI into your teams, into your fundraising? How is this playing out at ACLU?
Yeah, I mean, the ACLU has, as an organization, been involved in racial justice work since the 1930s. At the same time, we have historically been a primarily white-led organization. And so we have had to reach out and, we've had nonstop consultants working internally and externally with trainings. We've had to really come to terms with our own biases, the kind of the internal structural systems of white supremacy that were existing within the organization, and we're not done. This is a forever problem, and so we've done a lot of work. We have a 5-year, we call it EDIB. We add B for belonging. We have a 5-year roadmap for the organization. We just nominated our first board president, who is a person of color, in our first time in our 101-year history, Black woman, Deborah Archer. Our national board is now more than 40% POC, BIPOC, and our executive committee is more than 60% BIPOC. So we have really spent a lot of time diversifying our leadership, our staff. At the same time, when we launched a recent initiative called Systemic Equality, which is after this latest election, is one of our newer programs that we're coming out with to really focus on racial justice in the country. We realized it had to be just as much an internal program as it is an external program. So that has to do with retention, with onboarding, with training, the cultivation of Black leadership within the organization. And so this is, in terms of how it's related to fundraising, we have created a development roadmap that integrates DEI into really every aspect of our work, vendor diversity, the way we are kind of interrogating our donor communications, the language, the visuals, who's telling the stories, who's taking the photos, things like white saviorism, virtue signaling, tokenism, all the things that we're really interrogating and trying to avoid. And this has to do with diversifying who's telling the story. So we're putting a lot of effort there. We're also looking at donor diversity. We have a large acquisition budget for our high volume fundraising, and we are proposing putting at least 10% of that budget into a donor diversification testing plan for this coming year. So we're really excited to see how that goes. We're also updating all of our guidelines and policies, our gift acceptance guidelines, how to have difficult donor conversations, knowing that people of color who are fundraising face-to-face will face microaggressions. How do we deal with that? What does that mean for portfolio assignments? What does that mean for people meeting or not meeting their goals? And how do we ensure that frontline fundraisers are feeling safe throughout this process? We also even begun some self-education groups for white donors, and we've tested that in a few areas, which has been quite successful as well.
It's interesting of sort of finding a lane where it's like we can bring value and education and help our donors on their journey is I hadn't heard that before. And I love your just your terminology around like we're interrogating these things. Like I think that's the exact right way to think about it. All right, we're going to run up on time here. So I worked in a lot of the questions from the Q&A. Some of them I didn't. Some of them were very specific. So I apologize that we didn't get to all of them. I want to say thank you to everybody for joining us. I want to say thank you to our speakers. We could have done this for 2 hours and probably still had more to talk about. I'm lucky to be able to have conversations like this with each of you. And I'm glad that we could bring that to a larger group today. For everybody, you'll get information on this, but our next talk is going to be on Wednesday, March 10th, 1 p.m. Eastern time with Dennis Walcott. Dennis is the former Chancellor of Schools, New York City, current CEO of the Queens Library Foundation, or the Queens Public Library System, and then also on the board of Bloomberg Philanthropies. So Dennis has got a great story, and we look forward to sharing his voice with you. And I think that's all we got. So thank you very much, everybody, for being here. Mary, Lisa, Mark, thank you. Appreciate it.
Thanks.